So, you and I talked last week about this, and we talked about how, okay, there are factors that we want to take a look at and pay attention to when it comes to the question of race, racism, identity, et cetera, that exist in all of these zones. But certain zones are a little bit more prominent, let's say,
Yeah.
at least in terms of the influence that they're exerting on the other zones. This to me felt like the most important zones we want to talk about, in addition to some other things that's going on there. So yeah, I think the idea here is that if we change any factor, any significant factor in any of these zones, you see changes across all of the other zones. And this is, I think, a really important point, because all of these really they co-arise, they co-create each other, and they inform and influence each other from moment to moment. So the shape of one zone is therefore influencing the shape of all the other zones.
Right.
So I think these are probably the most critical ones. And it's interesting presenting it this way, because it feels like it kind of wavers between good news and bad news. Well, let me just say, between good news and, oh, we have some more work to do here. First and most primary is zone 2, the outside of the upper left, which refers to the structures of consciousness. When it comes to the topic of race, racism, and identity, zone 2 really sets the condition for all of these other zones, because zone 2 is the very seat of identity itself, and that identity grows through egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, and cosmocentric stages.
Right.
B, racism is itself a product of the early-most stages of development, which fortunately a plurality of people have evolved beyond. However, everyone starts at square one, meaning everyone has to grow through these stages in their lives, and not everyone makes it past the ethnocentric stage. In fact, maybe you'll have to give us the percentages again, Ken, but maybe roughly half or so, or even more, of people probably don't make it to world-centric, which means that maybe, 50 to 60% of adults in the world are at an ethnocentric level. Those are my birds. They have
60%.
50 to 60%?
Yeah, 60% on most tests. Some tests show 70%.
Yep.
So it's somewhere between 50 and 70%.
Okay.
In other words, the egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to cosmocentric is an incredibly important developmental sequence. And we have, I've talked about how slow evolution has been in getting up to even the rational scientific level. That's 200 years ago.
Right.
And prior to that time, going back at least several thousand years from 1500 Common Era to 10,000 before Common Era, we had a mythic ethnocentric approach.
Right.
And that's why we find so much warfare going on back those, is that they couldn't easily form larger cultural units that would come together. And so basically the only way that they did was fight, and the winner just owned the losers.
Right.
And that slowly, when some of them got very serious about fighting, then you get the Roman Empire and Mongolian Empire and stuff like that. And those truly brought huge numbers of people forced together. And sometimes the tension was too much to handle. Sometimes it wasn't. Generally speaking, in the best eras of the Roman Empire, for example, if you were conquered by Rome and you submitted and became a citizen of Rome, you would get all citizenship rights of a Roman. And so they handled that part pretty good. And it's one of the reasons that the Roman Empire could hang together for such a long time.
Yep.
Is it had people actually becoming members of that large collective. And so each individual would share the worldview of that large collective, And of course, in the 3rd century Common Era, that common worldview of the Roman Empire became officially Christianity. And so now in the upper left, in the lower left, in the lower right, you've got people really bound together in a strong glue. It was both social in terms of the structure it was laid out. The glue was cultural in terms of shared worldview. And it was individual in terms of you would do your individual Christian practice. So all of that is significant, but that was still all within an ethnocentric atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly.
So you still had slavery, you still had warfare, and so on. It wasn't until the emergence, again, Galileo and Kepler around 1605, where the emergence of science, particularly starting in the 17 and 1800s, that we started to get, well, democratic ideas of governance. And that's because individuals were continuing to grow up the level and expanding how their own consciousness could be. And they would go through archaic to egocentric to, at the very least, beginning ethnocentric. And this expanded the range of people that they could take in and be unified with in a very strong way. But there's still, wherever there's an ethnocentric bound, and let me just give a quick example of what ethnocentric actually means. If you take somebody at an egocentric stage, say age 3 or so, and you put a ball between you and the child, and the ball is green on one side and red on the other, and you spin it several times so they can see its different colors on each side, and you stop and you put the green side towards them and the red side towards you, and you ask them, what color are you seeing? They'll say green, because that's exactly what they're looking at, and green is right. If you then say, what color am I seeing? They'll say green, because they can't get that you're seeing red. They can't take the role of other. They can't take a second person perspective. So they can't get from egocentric to ethnocentric. But as the development continues, and in today's world, particularly around age 6 or 7, if you then put the ball between it and spin it, and you say, what side are you seeing? They'll say green. You say, what color am I seeing? They'll say red, because they can take your perspective. They can take the role of other, and that expands their world enormously from egocentric to ethnocentric rules and roles. And so that makes a huge difference.
Right.
And in both good ways and bad ways. The good ways is obvious, you can expand your identity and so on. The bad ways is you are, by the rather literal meaning of the word, you are ethnocentric. You will find some group that you'll identify with, and you'll find other groups to be less than that or inferior, right, or somehow rotten or subhuman or whatever terminology you want to use. The Nazis used that terminology for Jews. They were subhuman, they were apes, they were etc. And so, and the other thing to notice is that you might grow out of ethnocentric into world-centric, And by the way, when human beings did that, for the first time in history, they got rid of slavery.
Right. In zone 8. Yeah.
From around 1770 to 1870, slavery was outlawed for the first time in history in every rational industrial planet on the face of the globe. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And notice that's still only 200 or 300 years ago.
Right.
For our hundreds of thousands of years, until then, we lived with slavery. And we did because we couldn't get from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric.
Right.
So we're still an ethnocentric. So we still have a group politics, a group that we're identified with. And we find other groups that are inferior or subhuman or worth slavery or so on. I mean, even Aristotle doesn't have a problem with slavery. And I mean, that is just mind-boggling.
Right.
But so we get up to 1700, where the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is starting to take hold, and into 1800. And we really do start writing papers like the Equal Rights of Man.
Right.
And these written by the philosophers, the philosophers of the Enlightenment. And they maintain that all human beings, and originally they did mean all males, the rights of man was correctly titled as the rights of males, but every well-bodied property citizen male had equal rights, and that included equal rights before the king. And so this universal growth of identity is what let us move from ethnocentric into world-centric.
Right.
And that's when we really did outlaw slavery for the first time in history, make it illegal around the civilized world. And it was an enormous change.
So we're talking about how zone 2, how developments in zone 2, right, our cognitive intelligence and our moral intelligence grow into a world-centric point of view, and then you see it showing up in our systems. And this is, again, this is part of that sort of good news, bad news. The good news is something like 40-ish% of the world is now post-ethnocentric. The bad news is 50 to 60% of the world still is, and that continues to create a lot of problems.
Yeah.
The good news is the people who did make it to world-centric development then created a new set of systems in zone 8, largely because of the technologies that emerged out of the cognitive line, coupled with, dovetailed perfectly with the new moral intelligence that was coming online. And that resulted in these new systems, such as, hey, we can abolish slavery for the first time in human history. And in fact, that march of progress in zone 8 continues, Ken, because we have our zone 8, we can talk about our actual systems of governance, a third person in zone 8, which is a third person view of the systems in the lower right. The question here is, the primary question here is, when we're talking about the zones in the context of racism, is, do we still have discriminatory laws governing our society? And the good news is no. For the most part, we've gotten rid of the majority of laws that were produced by earlier ethnocentric stages of development in zone 2. Even more good news, Ken, is that even though a relatively smallish plurality of people moved beyond ethnocentric thinking, these laws govern everyone, regardless of your stage of development. And for that reason, they act as a sort of attractor point for all the other zones. They can kind of uplift development or maybe accelerate development a little bit, simply because that is the law of the land. And these laws now, thankfully, over the last several decades, have been made non-discriminatory and have been made increasingly world-centric. And that changes the structure of our reality. But there's a second beat to this too. I'll let you respond to that. But then there's also a second beat to how the difficulties that come with changing those systems.
Yeah. And it's very true that, well, the laws that govern our behavior, they correlate with interiors moving from archaic to egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to pluralistic and integral. But the fact is, everybody that's born has to move through all of those stages.
Exactly.
And so when we, particularly in the even 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, after we had finished the Civil War and basically established the fundamental rule that all men, and again, I mean males, black or white, have equal rights. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, things called Jim Crow laws tended to be written. And this is a good example of, we go through all the right-hand exterior written documents where all of our laws are recorded and embedded. They're put in right-hand, objective, exterior, individual, and collective realities. That's where they exist. So when in the 60s and 70s, we started to get rid of the written discriminatory laws, and we did, and to this day have done a very good job. That's right. We have, and the people going through and rewriting them were all basically world-centric.
Right.
Because they're the only ones that understood it and that really wanted to.
That's right.
So we've got essentially world-centric laws with some still exceptions.
We're ironing out some wrinkles.
Yeah, but compared to the way it was 50, 60, 80 years ago,
that's right,
an enormously deconstructing of racist legal laws.
Yes.
But what that doesn't handle is the person who's applying and interpreting those laws is at an egocentric or an ethnocentric or possibly a world-centric or pluralistic stage.
Yep.
And if 60 to 70% are still at ethnocentric or lower, then they're going to be the cops, for example, that are actually applying the laws.
Right.
And so maybe they're going to find themselves stopping Black people more often than they stop white people.
Exactly. Yep. Perfect example.
And that's why we still have a fair number of people who consider themselves activists, and they'll consider America racist to the core.
Right.
Even though legally we're anti-racist to the core, but in terms of our left-hand interior, subjective, first, second, third, fourth dimensions, we're still caught in egocentric to ethnocentric modes of awareness.
Yeah.
And that's what's so difficult for people to understand, because they can't just go out and wave flags and say, oh, we've got to get rid of these racist laws and all that, because the racist laws don't apply to these interiors.
Yeah, that's yeah. And if I can, because I just want to, because again, we're kind of switching zones here. So we're showing again, you change laws in zone 8, you're changing the actual systems themselves. And then of course, there's going to be a bit of a lag before the other zones sort of live up to those
Right.
types of social transformations. And one of those lags, we will see, for example, we want to acknowledge that previous laws, Jim Crow, redlining, which I'll talk about in just a sec, these laws have created inertias and repercussions and feedback loops that are still with us today, which
Right.
we can see in zone 7, which is a first-person view of systems in the lower right.
Right.
These are sort of autopoetically self-reinforcing patterns that emerged from previous laws, which are no longer with us. But
Right.
again, that pattern is still reinforcing itself. It's still
Right.
recapitulating itself, and it's still with us today. The classic example being, we can watch how these feedback loops get generated. The classic example is redlining policies from decades ago that prevented Black families from accumulating property and wealth, which in turn creates more impoverished neighborhoods with a smaller tax base, which in turn creates more impoverished schools with larger class sizes, less access to learning materials, lower quality teachers, less early education opportunities like kindergarten and preschool. Again, these are autopoetically self-reinforcing patterns that play themselves out over multiple generations, even after the laws that created those conditions were taken off the books. And I think this right here, Ken, is one of the most critical confusions I think people have today when they're talking about systemic racism. This is where, again, people are meaning different things by different words, because if systemic racism means, do we still have laws on the books that are generating new kinds of discrimination? No, that doesn't exist anymore. For the most part, that no longer exists. However, if we're talking about, we still have social patterns in our society that emerged from earlier laws, and we haven't figured out how to intervene with those patterns, right? They are still creating unequal opportunities and unequal outcomes, which is a whole other topic we can talk about, later or another time.
Yeah.
But this becomes sort of the conditions that these communities are dealing with and struggling with that feels systemic to them. So they point to words like systemic racism. And again, this is just where one example where I think the zones give us a much more granular understanding of what the real problem actually is and the types of interventions that we need to do in order to head these challenges off and to find a way to curtail these self-reinforcing patterns.
Right.